At a meeting of the Stewardship Council, which we have in Napanee for the county of Lennox and Addington, we found that people had different understandings of the two technical terms, Karst and Alvar. And so we thought we should try and do something to clarify the meaning of these words for everybody. And the very first one we want to show you is a cliff of limestone in Prince Edward County. Now, several things to be said about this. First of all, we say that it's in the St. Lawrence Plain, the Napanee St. Lawrence Plain. And you think, well, where's the plain? It's very bouncy. It's a big cliff. It's very high. But the plain is there in the background. When you look at the islands across Lake Ontario, you realize you are in a plain, but it's a plain with sharp bits of relief in the foreground, such as a cliff like this or a gorge. And this is in fact called Little Bluff. Now, the Little Bluff is limestone. And the whole point about karst is that karst is a special kind of limestone. It's calcium carbonate or magnesium carbonate, which is called dolostone, but we'll forget about it now and just call it calcium. It's calcium carbonate, and calcium carbonate is much more soluble. If you think of something like a granite, it's very, very slowly soluble, even in acid rain over millions of years. But calcium carbonate is fairly soluble as a rock. And that is the real essence of karst, that it dissolves. It can precipitate out again, but it dissolves. So in this cliff, you can see that down the bottom, this is winter, there is one stratum with ice coming out of the cliff. And you think, what's happening there? Well, what's happening there is that there's water in that layer, in that stratum of the limestone, for the simple reason that the rock is dissolved away and left a hollow. Then the hollow fills up with water. And so when there's a quick freezing episode, it comes out as ice. So the whole essence of karst is water movement in and out of the limestone. And it goes into all sorts of formations in the rock, holes of various kinds. So you have caves and caverns and underground streams and underground rivers. And some of the caverns, of course, are quite huge. And so what happens then is that the calcium carbonate can precipitate out again as stalactites and stalagmites. So there, over the huge long period of time, it's a dynamic system where the calcium is being dissolved and then precipitated and dissolved and precipitated. And then the long cliff here is just showing you exactly the same happening of one stratum in the limestone, which is holding the water, and that's where it's coming out and freezing. This is along 401. You've all seen places like this. The other thing to note about this is how many strata, how squished up and pushed down all these strata are. They're quite small layers, most of them, but very massive. And then on top of this, there's a thin layer of soil and rough rock where it's weathering on top. But in relation to most of the places around us, it's a very thin layer for things to grow in, and yet it's growing trees. And again, this is partially possible because the tree roots can get right down into hollows with water in them. And this is to show you a block diagram of exactly that. Limestone with underground caverns, underground streams, and connections between them that you wouldn't expect. So the karst then is an unexpected element in our whole geography, in that it can suddenly gush water out, and it can gush it upwards like an artesian well. The best example I can think of locally for that was a quarry in Westbrook, just on the edge of Kingston, which suddenly flooded overnight, including the machinery that was in it. It can be that fast. So all of these karstic landscapes can flood very quickly and quite often quite unpredictably and frequently. And other features on the top of the limestone are the up where it says D on the diagram, the vertical cracks. So as well as all the strata going sideways, you have vertical cracks of slightly softer or more soluble rock. And in this case, you get upright ridges, which are called grikes and clints. Also, the other features you can see on the top of this then are, we can see small vernal pools, which are very, very shallow and only last maybe 2 or 3 weeks when the flooding of the karst happens. Now, other top features, surface features of karst are that there may be big areas of absolutely flat, smooth limestone, off which the soil has been scraped in some previous era, but the soil is now formed again in the cracks, and so you get vegetation in the cracks. And the other next feature that one might mention is potholes. We have very few potholes here. So this is about one of the few photographs which is not local. This is from Rockwood down near Guelph, and it's a big pothole, but some areas have lots and lots of little potholes, not the size of this at all, where the solution of the rock has made a nice, neat column where the water can go, or air, in this case, just air can go. Now, this is the track of a stream which will only run probably in the spring, or perhaps after heavy rain, an intermittent stream, and yet it forms quite a large bed. And it's the rocks and bits of timber you can see in it show that it flows very fast when it's flowing. Now, the surface can also be, instead of that smooth limestone, it can be very broken up with small fragments. And often, if you pick these fragments up, you'll discover the millions of little tiny bits of fossils in them. And you can see that. And then there are also rather bigger fossils. This one says it's a smaller cephalopod because some of these cephalopods are, in fact, as long as your arm. And they're like an octopus or a squid, an old division one of that. So these rocks were old at the time of the dinosaurs. And so the forms of life which dominated the sea in which the limestone was made were not full of fish. They were full of these strange creatures like huge, great octopuses or small ones. The surface of the limestone is not necessarily in rectangular blocks. It can break like this in very irregular blocks. But look at the depth of the crack between. Some of these cracks you can get into and walk on the bottom of them, they're so big. But in this particular one, there are ferns growing up out of the bottom. Now that shows us that that crack has a slight little microclimate of its own, which is damper and warmer, so that the ferns can grow there and not on the surface. Not all of the surface of the limestone breaks into rectangular pieces and into these cracks. Some of the cracks are quite irregular. Now, this is one of the features to remember when anyone is planning to build or to make any kind of a structure on karst. For one thing, it's quite irregular, and for another, it has this huge, huge subterranean system of holes filled up with water. So two things can happen. The water can come up with an artesian flow and flood, and that happens very frequently. And the flow can also be extremely fast. The other is that there can be subsidence into the holes underground. So you get the caverns with bits falling down in them. And this means the whole surface is unstable and is a danger if one tries to build on the karst. Now, that's the last slide I'm going to show you of the surface of the karst. You're going on to talk about alvar.
Alvars are important and specialized ecosystems which feature little or no soil, and they develop on flat limestone or dolostone. While they aren't spectacular landscapes, and we often find ourselves overlooking them whilst walking, snowmobiling, or ATV driving over them, alvars are reasonably rare in the world. They occur in Scandinavia, and we have a concentration of this ecosystem around the Great Lakes, and especially here on the Napanee Plain. Alvar ecosystems endure despite experiencing tough climates at both ends of the year, with summertime drought, springtime flooding, and extreme cold in the winter. This is a picture of the Camden East Alvar, which is accessed from Fred Brown Road. This is an area that was farmed in the past and was also used as a municipal dump. There are 60 alvars measuring at least half a hectare in size that are scattered throughout the Napanee Plain, stretching from as far south as Prince Edward County and as far north as Marmora. Asselstein Alvar in Loyalist Township and Camden Alvar in Stone Mills are the largest examples of alvar, and no two alvars are the same. There are different microclimates for each, and they're visited by different communities of birds, and they host varying plants and species of invertebrates. This is another view of the Camden East Alvar, and you can see it has a carpet of flowering plants in the spring and the summer. This is a schematic that we developed to show you the different types of alvar. There are 5 common alvar types. Alvar communities will look different from one another depending upon the amount of soil that lies over the limestone, and that is shown in our schematic. It's been 10,000 years since the ice disappeared, and much of the soil and loose material lying over the bedrock was scraped away. Alvars will also differ from one another in appearance due to local influences like farming, grazing, and fire. And as I mentioned earlier, our schematic shows the 5 common types of alvar: woodland, savanna, shrubland, grassland, and pavement. And they will, of course, differ from one another according to the amount of soil that lies above the limestone. It's important to know that alvars are typically not neatly zoned. And in this photograph, we can see a combination of grassland, shrubland, and woodland. And there's also evidence, if you look closely, of soil erosion that happened because of an intermittent stream. And it sort of runs from the middle of the photograph and down to the lower left. This image is very typical of an alvar pavement. Algae, lichen, and sedum will grow on this pavement. And something that most of us have probably seen, but perhaps weren't sure what we were looking at, the dried up algae will form a kind of skirt. So that's that dark outline that we see on the pavement, that dark irregular outline. We refer to this sort of ecosystem as an alpine garden, and small flowering annuals are supported in an environment that's as harsh as this. These photographs were taken in December of 2022 at Amherst View, and they're wonderful photographs because they show the toughness and diversity of the moss, the lichen, and the sedum, how they thrive in such a very, very difficult ecosystem. Typically, in alvar ecosystems, the soil color will vary from gray to brown, and the soil is generally very sparsely distributed. Here's another example of the rather untidy zoning of an alvar ecosystem. So here we see a mixture of pavement, shrubland, and woodland. And lichen is very noticeable in this harsh environment. In the lower left of the photograph, we can see sort of 1 foot high clusters of lichen. Grassland alvar is what's most abundant on the Napanee Plain, and the grassland supports sedges, grasses, and flowering plants. And what we see here is the rather spectacular prairie smoke, and it blooms for a couple of weeks and is wonderful to see on the grassland alvar. Alvars also provide habitat for rare species of invertebrates like snails and leafhoppers, and all of the vegetation has its own special munchers and composters. Shrubland alvar typically supports prickly ash and juniper, and they provide food and refuge for moths and butterflies, and also for birds like the brown thrasher and the bobolink that are pictured here. The fruit of the berried plants feed the birds, and the leaves of the ash feed the butterfly caterpillars. And this is an example just of the variety of moths and butterflies found in a typical Alvar ecosystem. And then finally, we come to Alvar woodland, and the woodland areas provide habitat for passing bear, bobcat, deer, coyote, and other large mammals. There's a richness of diversity here with a mixture of evergreen and deciduous trees. And in places, the microclimate supports some forest herbs because there's enough moisture and shade. This photo, our final photo, is a really nice juxtaposition of the common and the rare. So we see the ubiquitous red cedar or juniper and the uncommon and endangered loggerhead shrike. Bird tourism is really important in our area. People are interested in the endangered species like bobolinks and loggerhead shrike. And as the population of our township increases, and the pressure of new and required infrastructure affects our ecosystem, it's really important that we protect and nurture our diverse landscapes for future generations.